Senator Duckworth came to the Senate floor with prosthetic legs and a soldier's creed, and a question for the draft dodger. She came to the Senate floor in a wheelchair. Not because she had to, because the injuries she sustained in Iraq, the same war she invoked at the beginning of her speech, took both of her legs and part of her right arm, and on some days the prosthetics are not what she chooses for a floor session. She came to speak about a war she did not choose and a commander she did not elect as the leader of the institution she had given her body to serve. She came to speak because she had promised she would. She had made the promise before she was a senator, before she was a congresswoman, in a hospital room at Walter Reed Army Medical Center, where she spent nearly a year recovering from the wounds she earned in Iraq. She had a poster on the wall next to her hospital bed, a framed copy of the Soldier's Creed, 13 lines, the words that those who wear the Army uniform live by. She read it every morning when she struggled to sit up straight. She read it before every surgery she was rolled into. It hung next to her bed in the hospital. It hangs next to her desk in Washington. She glanced at it the morning she came to the floor. She said there was perhaps no greater proof that Donald Trump had never deigned to serve a day in his life than the mockery he made of that creed every single day he had been in office. This channel tracks the documentation as it moves through the legal system. If you want to follow where this goes, subscribe and turn on notifications. New videos drop when the record produces something worth documenting. Let's start with the creed. The Soldier's Creed is 13 lines. It commits the person who takes it to specific things: to be disciplined, physically and mentally tough, trained, proficient, to look out for those who look out for them, to never quit, to never leave a fallen comrade behind. These are not aspirational statements. They are performance standards. They are the commitments that the United States Army asks its soldiers to live by, not just in combat, but in every professional capacity, every day of service. Duckworth noted that the creed may be associated with the Army, but the sentiments hold true for all who wear the uniform: the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines, the Space Force. Every branch of the American military is built on some version of these commitments. The creed is a performance standard, not a statement of aspiration. The soldiers who take it are expected to demonstrate through their daily conduct and their conduct under fire that they have internalized what it describes. The commitment to never quit, to never leave a comrade behind, is not an abstract moral aspiration. It is the specific standard that determines whether you are the kind of soldier the Army needs you to be. The people who serve under the Commander-in-Chief have sworn to live by those standards. The Commander-in-Chief has not. Donald Trump received 5 draft deferments during the Vietnam War. She bled in Iraq. He got bone spurs. That is the documented record of their respective service. 4 were academic, 1 was medical. Bone spurs, a condition that his own family members have since disputed in documented accounts. He did not serve. He never stood where Duckworth stood. He never took the oath she took. He never made the commitments the Soldier's Creed describes. He has been the Commander-in-Chief of the world's most powerful military without ever having served in that military, without ever having been in a position where the standards he now commands others to live by had any claim on his own conduct. Duckworth called him Cadet Bone Spurs on the floor of the United States Senate, not as an insult, as a documented biographical fact framed in the language of the institution he was given deferments to avoid. The Walter Reed juxtaposition is the moral foundation of everything she said. Duckworth spent nearly a year at Walter Reed. She was there because her Black Hawk helicopter was shot down over Iraq on November 12, 2004. She was the co-pilot. The rocket-propelled grenade that hit the aircraft did not discriminate between mission-critical limbs. It took both of her legs above the knee. Her right arm was damaged so severely that the surgeons who received her were initially uncertain whether they could save it at all. They operated, they made the decision to try. It was not guaranteed. She was medevaced, stabilized, and flown home with the uncertainty still unresolved. She was not alone in the ward at Walter Reed. Other wounded soldiers were there, men and women who had come back from the same war with different wounds, different missing pieces, different surgeries to get through. The ward where she recovered was not a private room with a poster on the wall and a quiet space to process what had happened. It was a shared space where the cost of the war was distributed across multiple beds, multiple bodies, multiple recovery trajectories. She spent nearly a year in that environment. She learned what the cost looked like at scale, not as a single experience, but as a ward full of them. She read the Soldier's Creed every morning, not because she had to, because the creed was what remained when the body it describes had been taken away from her. The discipline, the mental toughness, the refusal to quit, those commitments were not in her legs, they were in her. In a ward full of people who were paying the cost of orders given by people who had never paid it themselves, the creed was not abstract. It was the specific thing that the people around her were demonstrating by being there, by surviving, by working through the surgeries, by refusing to let the word quit apply to them. She earned the right to speak about what the military costs the people who serve in it by paying that cost herself. That is the moral authority from which she spoke, not political experience, not policy expertise. The kind of authority that comes only from personal experience with the specific reality she was describing, what it means to send people into combat, what the consequences of those orders look like in hospital beds, in flag-draped coffins, in the daily lives of the families who wait. The person she was speaking about has no equivalent authority. He received 5 deferments. He never served. He never paid the cost she paid. He is now the commander-in-chief of the institution she served, making the decisions that determine what other Americans are asked to pay. That is the contrast. It is not rhetorical. It is biographical. It is documented. The 5 draft deferments are in the public record. The Vietnam War records are public records. The medical deferment, the Bone Spurs, is documented in federal selective service files. The accounts of the circumstances surrounding that deferment, including the testimony of family members, are part of the documented biography of the person who is now the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Duckworth's combat service, her injuries, her time at Walter Reed, those are also documented in medical records and military service records, and the physical reality of her body and the prosthetics she wears to stand at the Senate podium. One person served, one person did not, one person paid the cost she was describing, one person has never come close to paying it. The question of who has the standing to make the argument Duckworth was making is answered by that contrast, which is why she led with it. Now let's talk about the war itself and the specific costs Duckworth enumerated. She was not speaking from theory, she was speaking from the inside of the cost she was describing. 6 weeks, 13 dead, hundreds wounded, no end state, no congressional authorization. 6 weeks into the conflict, 13 American service members killed, hundreds wounded. Those numbers are not statistics, they are the 13 families that have been contacted by an officer in dress uniform delivering the news that no family wants to receive. They are the hundreds of people currently in military hospitals, in some cases going through what Duckworth went through, the surgeries, the recovery, the reconstruction of lives around what remains after combat takes what it takes. Duckworth knows what that looks like from the inside. She spent nearly a year on that inside. The 13 dead and the hundreds wounded are not a data point in a policy debate. They are people whose names will eventually be added to a memorial somewhere, families who will mark anniversaries, children who will grow up knowing their parent died in a conflict that was, in Duckworth's characterization, entirely a war of choice. A new and reportedly more radical Ayatollah is now in power in Iran, younger than his predecessor, the generational shift in Iranian leadership that some analysts had long anticipated and feared, now produced under circumstances that Duckworth characterized as the direct result of the president's choices. Gas prices spiking at the pump, creating the specific economic arithmetic that ordinary Americans face. You need to get to work, you need to take your children to school, you need to take your aging parents to the doctor, and every one of those trips now cost more because of a war of choice, launched without congressional authorization. The farmers of Illinois, she said, the farmers of this great nation, at the time they should be planting, their input costs had skyrocketed because of the conflict. The practical consequences of military action in the Persian Gulf region are not abstract for agriculture. Fuel costs, shipping costs, the price of the petrochemical inputs that modern farming requires, all of those are indexed directly or indirectly to the price of oil and the stability of the supply routes through which it moves. The Strait of Hormuz is one of those routes. The Strait of Hormuz. Duckworth described a partial military blockade, launched without justification, without explanation, without any articulated plan for what comes next. The Strait of Hormuz is the narrow waterway through which a significant portion of the world's oil supply flows. A military action affecting that waterway has consequences for global oil markets, for shipping insurance, for the economic calculations of every country that depends on energy from the Persian Gulf. Duckworth noted that Trump did not know what the end state was. Not that he had a different view of the end state, that he did not know what the term meant. End state is a military term of art. It describes the desired outcome of a military operation, the conditions that would need to exist for the mission to be considered accomplished and forces to be withdrawn. Every military operation requires an end state because without one the operation has no defined conclusion. Troops cannot be brought home if there is no definition of what conditions would make bringing them home appropriate. The absence of an end state is not just a planning failure. It is the specific failure that produces indefinite deployments, protracted engagements, mission creep, the features of the wars that Duckworth spent years recovering from and then years trying to prevent. She said the president not only had no idea what the end state was for this war of choice, but apparently did not even know what the term end state meant. Duckworth knows what end state means because she used it, not in a briefing room as a policy official, as a pilot in the pre-mission briefings that precede every combat sortie. Before a military aircraft takes off on an operational mission, the crew is briefed on the mission's end state, what the conditions are that define success, what the trigger points are for each phase, what comes next. The end state is not optional information in a pre-flight briefing. It is the organizing framework around which every other piece of mission planning is arranged. You do not fly into a combat zone without knowing what success looks like and how you'll know when you've achieved it. That is a specific claim about the Commander-in-Chief's knowledge of the vocabulary of military operations, vocabulary that Duckworth learned not from policy manuals but from operational practice. The concept of an end state is foundational to military planning in a way that is not easily grasped by someone who has never planned or participated in a military operation. It is the organizing principle of military action, the definition of what success looks like, without which there is no way to know when the mission is accomplished, when troops can be withdrawn, when resources can be reallocated. She knows what end state means. She made clear what its absence implies for the people currently deployed. Without an end state, the deployment has no defined conclusion. The soldiers packing their rucks, the families waiting for news from half a world away, the people in military hospitals, none of them can be told when it ends because no one has defined what ending looks like. Then she said, the problem is the guy who claims to be making America great again looks at the word America and only sees the letters M and E in the middle of it. The War Powers Resolution is the constitutional layer of the speech, and it requires specific examination. She had served under the Constitution she was about to cite. She had the moral authority. Now she had the constitutional argument. The War Powers Resolution is a 1973 federal statute that was enacted after the Vietnam War, which Donald Trump received 5 deferments to avoid, to constrain the president's ability to commit United States forces to armed conflict without congressional authorization. It requires the president to notify Congress within 48 hours of committing forces and limits the duration of military engagement to 60 days without congressional authorization or a declaration of war. Duckworth was not invoking the War Powers Resolution as a procedural technicality. She was invoking Article 1 of the Constitution directly. The Constitution does not give the president the power to declare war. Article 1 grants that power explicitly to Congress. Only Congress has the power to declare war. The founders who wrote that provision were deliberate. They had just emerged from a system in which a monarch could commit the nation to war without the consent of the governed. They had witnessed what happens when a single executive can make war unilaterally, the endless wars of European monarchs, fought with the lives of subjects who had no voice in the decision. They designed a system in which the branch most directly accountable to the people, the legislative branch, the one that faces the voters most frequently, would have to make the decision that costs the most lives and the most money. This was not an oversight or a technicality. It was a foundational choice about where the most consequential power in a democracy should reside. The power to take the country to war should require the consent of the representatives of the people who will fight that war, pay for it, and live with its consequences. The president can direct the military once war is authorized. He cannot authorize it himself. Trump was acting, Duckworth said, as if Article 1 simply did not exist, as if obeying the Constitution were optional, as if the founding document were a yellowing piece of paper that could be crumpled and discarded. She invited him to come to the Senate. She noted it was 20 minutes from the White House. She noted he knew where the Capitol was. It was the building he had directed the January 6th insurrectionists to march toward. She said, if your administration believes this war is justified, come to Congress and make your case. Explain it to the American people through their elected representatives. Tell us why this conflict is worth the 13 lives already lost. Tell us what the end state is. Give us something to vote on. The alternative, she said, begged the question, what are you hiding? The vote she was calling for is the constitutional obligation she was describing. Senators and representatives represent the people who will pay the cost of the war and their children, their taxes, their gas prices. They are the people the Constitution charged with making the decision to commit the nation to armed conflict. The executive cannot bypass that process without bypassing the Constitution. Trump had been in this conflict for more than 6 weeks without bringing it to Congress for authorization. Duckworth gave her Republican colleagues a choice. 13 dead, no end state, no congressional authorization, 1 vote coming. She framed it simply: vote with me to end this conflict and show that you actually care about putting America first, as you claim, or vote to put Trump's ego first, proving that when push comes to shove, you care more about protecting Trump's thin skin than the Constitution you swore to defend. That is not a rhetorical device, it is a procedural reality. A war powers resolution forces a vote. It requires members to take a position. It makes the constitutional question a recorded act rather than a general posture. Every senator who votes against the resolution is voting on the record to continue an unauthorized war. Every senator who votes for it is voting on the record to require the president to comply with the Constitution. The Republican senators in the chamber during that speech, the people Duckworth was addressing directly, had a specific calculation to make. They had sworn the same oath Duckworth had sworn. They had sworn to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. The Constitution says only Congress can declare war. The president was conducting a war without congressional authorization. Voting against the War Powers Resolution was in the framework Duckworth was laying out, a vote to exempt the president from the Constitution they had sworn to defend. The oath of office is a formal commitment made on the Senate floor, recorded in the official proceedings. When a senator votes, that vote becomes part of the permanent legislative record. The vote on the War Powers Resolution would not be a private calculation. It would be a documented act, available to the voters who elected those senators, to the historians who would later evaluate this period, to the families of the 13 dead who would want to know whether the people they elected considered the question of whether their children died in an authorized war. Every senator who voted against the resolution would be making a specific documented choice to continue an unauthorized military operation. Duckworth was not asking her Republican colleagues to oppose the president. She was asking them to honor the oath they had already taken. She had taken the same oath. She had also bled for the country that oath was sworn to serve. The combination of constitutional obligation and personal sacrifice is what gave the request its specific weight. Duckworth said she would not wish another endless, needless, unjustified war like the one she served in on anybody else. Not on the heroes packing their rucks right now, not on their families, not on the American people who want their president focused on bringing costs down at home. She said she ran for Congress not because she wanted to be there, but to honor the men and women who carried her out of that war zone. She made a promise to the troops she deployed with and to everyone who has served since she hung up her uniform. When the drums of war started beating again, she would be in a position to ensure that elected officials fully considered the true cost, not just in money, but in human lives and in the sacrifices of the people who wear the colors of this nation. She was keeping that promise on the Senate floor, not symbolically, concretely. A war powers resolution is a legal instrument. It has force. When it comes to the floor, senators must vote. The vote creates a record. The record is the accountability that the speech was building toward. Duckworth was not giving a speech to be reported on and forgotten. She was announcing a vote that would require every member of the Senate to take a position on whether the president had the constitutional authority to keep American troops in this conflict without congressional authorization. That position would be in the permanent record of the United States Senate. She noted what was at stake for the people on the other side of the decision she was describing. The heroes packing their rucks right now, the families spending their days anxiously awaiting news from half a world away, the parents who might be grieving, the children who might be growing up without a parent. She would not wish this on any of them. She knew what it cost because she had paid part of it herself. The senator who left her blood in the Iraqi desert is asking him to justify it. The Constitution says Congress decides. The 5-time draft dodger hasn't asked them. He hasn't asked anyone.